The microphone screamed with a high-pitched squeal, like glass cracking under pressure, and for a heartbeat it seemed as though even the walls of the Hale Theater trembled. She froze under the spotlight, her shadow stretching long and thin across the stage floor, clutching the strap of the wicker basket that still hung absurdly from her arm. In it lay roses wrapped in cheap paper, packets of gum, and candy bars. Ordinary things, the kind of things sold at subway stations or cram bodegas, not under a chandelier worth more than her father's entire house. The eyes of hundreds of strangers pinned her like arrows. Women in sequin gowns arched their brows. Men in pressed tuxedos whispered behind polite hands. Laughter rippled from somewhere in the back, sharp and cutting, the kind of laughter meant to slice a person into pieces. She wasn't supposed to be here. A few minutes earlier she had been weaving through the velvet aisles, head lowered, voice soft. Roses, $1. Candies, 2 for $5. She hadn't dared to meet anyone's eyes. Some ignored her. Some waved her away like a beggar. A man hissed, "Get her out of here." And then she had hummed. A sound no louder than a breath, the old habit escaping her chest, a fragment of a melody she used to rehearse in rehearsal rooms built for dreams. That was when Jonathan Hale had heard her. The composer himself, silver-haired, sharp-eyed, seated at the gleaming Steinway Grand in the middle of the stage. His name carried a gravity that silenced orchestras. And yet he had turned, stared directly at her, and spoken into the microphone with a voice that brooked no refusal. "You, sing." And so she stood, barefoot under the lights, her dress frayed at the hem, her hair falling loose around her shoulders, a girl out of place in a kingdom of velvet and marble. Her heart hammered. Her throat was a fist. Every instinct screamed at her to run. But then she remembered. She remembered the echo of practice rooms, the sting of rosin on her fingertips as she held sheet music, the way her professors once said her voice could stop time. She remembered her father, lying pale in a hospital bed, telling her through the rasp of failing lungs, "Never let the world silence you, Eliza." So she closed her eyes, and when the first note slipped free, it was not timid, not broken. It was clear, piercing, unyielding. The room fell silent. The city never gave a rest. Even before the sun rose, its arteries pulsed. Taxi horns stabbing the air, subway trains rattling beneath the ground, footsteps endless as rain. By the time the evening glow fell between the skyscrapers, Eliza Maren's feet ached, her basket lighter, but her body heavy with exhaustion. She had walked almost 8 miles, she guessed. The sandals she wore had worn so thin she could feel the sharp cracks in the sidewalk, the sticky residue of gum ground into subway steps, the faint heat that lingered on the pavement long after the sun had passed. Her basket held fewer things now. A handful of roses, their petals wilting, 3 candy bars, a few packs of gum. Enough coins clinked inside to buy a sandwich, maybe a cup of soup if she was lucky. Never enough for rent. Rent was a monster she chased but never caught, always a week away from swallowing her whole. People didn't see her. Not really. They saw a nuisance, a shadow hovering at the edge of their polished lives. A girl muttering about roses, shoving gum under their noses, invading the glossy surface of their evenings. They didn't see the calluses on her hands from years of practicing scales, the hours she'd spent breathing through arias until her lungs burned. They didn't see the girl who had once been called the prodigy with the silver voice. At the corner of 45th and Broadway, she stopped. The street musicians were already there, claiming their patch of sidewalk like kings of the night. A trumpet cut through the air, playful and raw. A guitar strummed steady chords. A saxophone moaned with aching sweetness. Tourists stopped, clapped, dropped bills into open cases. Eliza lingered at the edge of the circle, her body still but her soul restless. Music was gravity. It pulled her, no matter how far she tried to escape. She closed her eyes for a moment, just long enough to let the sound wash through her, and before she knew it, a hum escaped her throat. A harmony, soft, instinctive, uninvited. The saxophonist's melody curled around it, as though recognizing her. For a fleeting moment, it felt like she belonged, like she was not just another ghost in the crowd, but part of something alive. A child holding his mother's hand turned, staring up at her with wide eyes. He smiled. Then one of the buskers noticed. His eyes narrowed, protective, territorial. He shook his head sharply, as though to warn her off. Eliza flushed. The hum died. She gripped her basket tighter and slipped back into the flow of strangers, hiding her voice in silence again. She hadn't always been invisible. 3 years ago, her world had been marble halls and high ceilings, rehearsal rooms humming with ambition. The New York Conservatory of Music had been her miracle, a scholarship gifted to a girl who had grown up singing in church basements, whose father scraped together money for lessons with a teacher who believed in her. At the conservatory, she had felt infinite. Her professors praised her diction, her control, the way her voice seemed older than her years. Some called her a star in the making. She dreamed of opera houses, of concert stages, of living a life made entirely of song. But life does not bend to dreams. Her father's illness had crept in like a thief, sudden and merciless. One day he was strong, working double shifts at the factory to keep them afloat. The next, he was coughing blood into tissues, his body weakening faster than doctors could name the disease. The bills came like waves, doctor visits, treatments, medications. Her scholarship covered tuition, yes, but not rent, not food, not the endless hospital debt. She was 19 when she made the choice. She stood outside the conservatory's glass doors, holding the withdrawal papers in her trembling hands, while other students hurried past with instruments on their backs, sheet music clutched to their chests. The building looked enormous that day, like a cathedral, and she felt like a sinner walking away from the only faith she had ever known. She chose family. She always would. Her father passed a year later. His last words to her still lived in her bones. Never let the world silence you, Eliza. Promise me. But grief has a way of turning promises into stones too heavy to carry. When he was gone, the conservatory seemed like another lifetime. She had no money, no home, no one left to lean on. So she became what she was now, a girl with a basket, drifting through the veins of Manhattan, invisible except for the brief annoyance she brought to others. That night, hunger drove her to the Hale Theater. She didn't go for the music. She couldn't afford music. She went for the patrons, the glittering crowd with purses heavy enough that $1 for a rose meant nothing. Security had let her slip in, as they sometimes did, with the understanding she'd leave before the show began. The theater smelled of polished wood, velvet curtains, perfume worth more than she made in a month. She felt small there, smaller than usual, her sandals whispering against the plush carpet. She walked the aisles, head down, roses $1. Candies, 2 for $5. A woman waved her away. A man muttered something cruel. Someone laughed, and the sound stuck in her ribs. She thought of leaving, and then she forgot herself. Her lips parted, and a hum drifted out. Barely a note. Really, just a fragment of something she'd once sung 100 times in practice rooms. Ave Maria. And Jonathan Hale heard it. He turned on his bench, eyes sharp as glass. He looked at her as if she were not a nuisance, but an unanswered question. You, he said into the microphone. His voice filled the hall. Sing. And in a blink, the basket girl was no longer hidden in the aisles. She was on the stage, the spotlight searing her skin, the world watching, waiting for her to fail. The first note hovered in the air like a shard of light, fragile yet piercing enough to slice through laughter. Eliza felt it tremble inside her chest, vibrating against her ribs, echoing in her skull. For a split second, she thought it would shatter, that the sound would collapse into the silence of humiliation. But it didn't. It grew. Her voice gathered strength, as though it had been waiting, caged for years. She sang not for the audience, not even for the composer whose sharp eyes pierced her from the piano, but for the ghosts who lived inside her. The girl she used to be, the father who had told her never to fall silent, the dream she had buried beneath exhaustion and hunger. The first rows of the audience stopped whispering. The smirk on a woman's painted lips softened. The laughter in the back strangled itself into silence. Her voice swelled, low, trembling at first, then rich and golden, wrapping the hall in warmth. The chandeliers seemed to hum with her, vibrating in sympathy. The theater became something smaller, more intimate. And yet Eliza felt herself growing larger, taller, braver. She remembered another stage, years ago, her first recital at the Conservatory. She had stood trembling then too, her hands slick with sweat, her eyes searching the crowd until they found her father sitting in the third row, coughing softly into his handkerchief, but smiling like he had given birth to the sun. "You belong there," he had whispered to her backstage, "even if they don't see it yet." And when she had sung then, she had felt the same thing she felt now. That music was not something she created, but something she uncovered, something hidden inside the world that only she could set free. Her voice climbed, threading itself through the architecture, curling along the balconies, slipping into the shadows where even the ushers forgot to breathe. She let it open, let it crack at the edges where grief lived, let it shimmer where hope still burned. She was no longer Eliza the vendor. She was Eliza the prodigy, the girl with a scholarship, the voice that professors had once whispered could shake opera houses. And for the first time in years, she believed it again. Jonathan Hale leaned back on the piano bench, eyes sharp but unreadable. His hands hovered above the keys, as though he were accompanying her in his mind. The corner of his mouth twitched, the faintest ghost of approval. This was what he had heard in that sing-along. Not chance, not accident. A voice raw but honed, disciplined once, carrying both ruin and brilliance. The audience shifted, restless not with impatience but with awe. A man in the fourth row leaned forward. A woman dabbed her eyes though the song was not yet finished. Eliza felt the weight of it, of being seen again. It was terrifying, intoxicating. She wanted to run, and she wanted to stay forever. Then came the climax. Her lungs burned, her throat tightened, but she pushed through, riding the wave of breath until it threatened to tear her apart. The note rang clear, pure, impossibly long, and when it finally broke into silence, the theater itself seemed to collapse inward. A heartbeat, too, and then applause. It started small, a scattered clap from somewhere near the back, uncertain, almost embarrassed. Then another, then more, until the sound swelled into a storm, a rising thunder that shook the chandeliers. People rose to their feet, gowns glittering, tuxedos stiff but moving, hands crashing together in praise she had not expected, praise she had almost forgotten how to dream of. They were standing. For her. Eliza's chest heaved, her hands trembling around the useless basket still clutched in her grip. Her throat ached with both exhaustion and ecstasy. She blinked rapidly, the lights blurring into stars, the faces of the crowd dissolving into a sea of astonishment. She wanted to cry. She wanted to laugh. Instead, she simply stood there, stunned, as if she had been struck by lightning. Jonathan Hale rose from his bench. The applause dimmed slightly, as though the audience held its breath, waiting for his verdict. He approached her slowly, each step deliberate, his shoes clicking softly against the polished wood of the stage. He stopped a few feet away, studying her as though she were both specimen and miracle. "What is your name?" he asked. Eliza swallowed, her voice hoarse. Eliza Maren." A murmur rippled through the hall, her name carried from mouth to mouth like a rumor just discovered. Jonathan's gaze lingered on her basket, on her bare feet, on the frayed edges of her dress, and then back to her eyes. "You have a gift," he said simply, but his tone carried weight, as though those 4 words were carved into stone. "A gift that doesn't belong in the aisles, or on the street." Her lips parted, but no words came. She felt exposed, stripped bare by both the stage lights and his scrutiny. Jonathan turned to the audience. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, voice echoing, "tonight you have not only heard music, you have witnessed discovery." The applause roared again, louder than before, filling every crevice of the hall. Eliza's knees weakened. She gripped her basket tighter, afraid that without it she might float away entirely. And in that thunder of clapping hands, Eliza remembered her father again. His last night, the oxygen machine humming beside the bed, his eyes clouded but still fixed on her with fierce love. "Promise me, Eliza. Don't let them silence you." She had nodded then, too afraid to cry, but in truth she had broken that promise the moment she walked away from the conservatory. Until tonight. Tonight she had kept it. And as the applause washed over her, Eliza felt something inside her shift, awaken, burn. Not just the memory of who she had been, but the possibility of who she might still become. The first note hovered in the air like a shard of light, fragile yet piercing enough to slice through laughter. Eliza felt it tremble inside her chest, vibrating against her ribs, echoing in her skull. For a split second, she thought it would shatter, that the sound would collapse into the silence of humiliation. But it didn't. It grew. Her voice gathered strength, as though it had been waiting, caged for years. She sang not for the audience, not even for the composer whose sharp eyes pierced her from the piano, but for the ghosts who lived inside her. The girl she used to be, the father who had told her never to fall silent, the dream she had buried beneath exhaustion and hunger. The first rows of the audience stopped whispering. The smirk on a woman's painted lips softened. The laughter in the back strangled itself into silence. Her voice swelled, low, trembling at first, then rich and golden, wrapping the hall in warmth. The chandeliers seemed to hum with her, vibrating in sympathy. The theater became something smaller, more intimate. And yet Eliza felt herself growing larger, taller, braver. She remembered another stage, years ago, her first recital at the Conservatory. She had stood trembling then too, her hands slick with sweat, her eyes searching the crowd until they found her father sitting in the third row, coughing softly into his handkerchief, but smiling like he had given birth to the sun. "You belong there," he had whispered to her backstage, "even if they don't see it yet." And when she had sung then, she had felt the same thing she felt now. That music was not something she created, but something she uncovered, something hidden inside the world that only she could set free. Her voice climbed, threading itself through the architecture, curling along the balconies, slipping into the shadows where even the ushers forgot to breathe. She let it open, let it crack at the edges where grief lived, let it shimmer where hope still burned. The applause didn't stop. It crashed and surged and softened only to swell again, like the Atlantic worrying a stubborn shore. Eliza stood in the middle of it, stunned, as if she'd just emerged from deep water. The lights were still too bright. The faces in the crowd were a constellation of dazzle and blur. Somewhere behind her, the piano's lid caught a white-hot blade of light and threw it back in her eyes. She lifted a hand without thinking, shielding herself, and felt the wicker handle of the basket bite into her palm, an anchor to the life she had walked in with. "Come," Jonathan Hale said, not to her, but to the stage manager hovering in the wings. "Bring her backstage." A hand touched Eliza's elbow, gentle at first, then firmer, as if to keep her from toppling forward. She nodded dumbly and let herself be led. As she turned, the audience seemed to tilt, all those standing figures still clapping, their sound now, behind her like rain she had survived. The curtains swallowed the storm. The sudden hush of backstage hit like a soft wall. The smell of dust and cables, paint and old wood, a quiet maid of whispered cues and clipped footsteps. "Over here," someone said. A woman in black with an earpiece motioned toward a folding chair next to a rack of spare music stands. "Water?" Eliza realized her mouth was a desert. She nodded again. Her throat burned as if she'd swallowed an ember. The water was cold enough to bring tears to her eyes. Jonathan appeared a moment later, his presence bending the air around him. Up close, he was both grander and smaller. Silver hair more unruly than it looked from the audience. Faint shadows under his eyes that spoke of sleepless weeks, a tie loosened just enough to suggest war with formality. He stopped a few feet from her, looked at the basket dangling absurdly from her hand, and then at her face. "Sit," he said. It wasn't a command so much as a blueprint for sanity. She was no longer Eliza the vendor. She was Eliza the prodigy, the girl with a scholarship, the voice that professors had once whispered could shake opera houses. And for the first time in years, she believed it again. Jonathan Hale leaned back on the piano bench, eyes sharp but unreadable. His hands hovered above the keys, as though he were accompanying her in his mind. The corner of his mouth twitched, the faintest ghost of approval. This was what he had heard in that sing-along. Not chance, not accident. A voice raw but honed, disciplined once, carrying both ruin and brilliance. The audience shifted, restless not with impatience but with awe. A man in the fourth row leaned forward. A woman dabbed her eyes though the song was not yet finished. Eliza felt the weight of it, of being seen again. It was terrifying, intoxicating. She wanted to run, and she wanted to stay forever. Then came the climax. Her lungs burned, her throat tightened, but she pushed through, riding the wave of breath until it threatened to tear her apart. The note rang clear, pure, impossibly long, and when it finally broke into silence, the theater itself seemed to collapse inward. A heartbeat, too, and then applause. It started small, a scattered clap from somewhere near the back, uncertain, almost embarrassed. Then another, then more, until the sound swelled into a storm, a rising thunder that shook the chandeliers. People rose to their feet, gowns glittering, tuxedos stiff but moving, hands crashing together in praise she had not expected, praise she had almost forgotten how to dream of. They were standing. For her. Eliza's chest heaved, her hands trembling around the useless basket still clutched in her grip. Her throat ached with both exhaustion and ecstasy. She blinked rapidly, the lights blurring into stars, the faces of the crowd dissolving into a sea of astonishment. She wanted to cry. She wanted to laugh. Instead, she simply stood there, stunned, as if she had been struck by lightning. He pulled over a second chair, turned it backward, and straddled it like a conspirator. "Breathe." She breathed. It was ragged at first, then steadier, the way her first long note had steadied once she trusted it to hold. She started, then stopped. What could she say? Who are you? What has happened? Who am I now? He saved her. Eliza Maren. The way he said her name made it sound inevitable. Where did you learn to do that? I studied. Once, she said, her voice still raw from the stage. I was at the Conservatory. I left. Why? My dad. The two words were a small room with no windows. She didn't know how to furnish them for a stranger. Jonathan nodded as if he'd expected that answer. I'm sorry. He meant it. She felt that. The sympathy wasn't a performance. Not in a man whose whole life was performance. That pierced her more than any pity could have. What you did out there, he said, eyes sharp now, was not beginner's luck. It was craft remembering itself. How long since you sang like that? Eliza stared at the bottle cap twisted between her fingers. 3 years since I stood on a stage. 2 since I stopped singing out loud. You've been singing anyway, he said. It wasn't a question. In my head, she admitted, and felt suddenly foolish. And under my breath, when I think no one can hear. I heard. He turned slightly, as if the stage manager's corridor of cues and gaff tape were a city street where a miracle had strolled by. A single phrase, and it was enough to know. To know what? That there was a voice in the room I hadn't invited but couldn't afford to ignore. Somewhere down the hall, a door shut gently. A violinist brushed past with a case in hand, eyes darting, curious. Eliza lowered the basket to the floor, and the absence of its weight surprised her. The muscle memory of carrying it sagged out of her shoulders like a shrugged-off winter coat. You put me on stage, she said slowly, tasting the truth of it in her mouth. Jonathan Hale rose from his bench. The applause dimmed slightly, as though the audience held its breath, waiting for his verdict. He approached her slowly, each step deliberate, his shoes clicking softly against the polished wood of the stage. He stopped a few feet away, studying her as though she were both specimen and miracle. What is your name? He asked. Eliza swallowed, her voice hoarse. Eliza. Eliza Maren. A murmur rippled through the hall, her name carried from mouth to mouth like a rumor just discovered. Jonathan's gaze lingered on her basket, on her bare feet, on the frayed edges of her dress, and then back to her eyes. "You have a gift," he said simply, but his tone carried weight, as though those 4 words were carved into stone. "A gift that doesn't belong in the aisles or on the street." Her lips parted, but no words came. She felt exposed, stripped bare by both the stage lights and his scrutiny. Jonathan turned to the audience. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, voice echoing, "tonight you have not only heard music, you have witnessed discovery." The applause roared again, louder than before, filling every crevice of the hall. Eliza's knees weakened. She gripped her basket tighter, afraid that without it she might float away entirely. And in that thunder of clapping hands, Eliza remembered her father again. His last night, the oxygen machine humming beside the bed, his eyes clouded but still fixed on her with fierce love. "Promise me, Eliza. Don't let them silence you." She had nodded then, too afraid to cry, but in truth she had broken that promise the moment she walked away from the conservatory. Until tonight. Tonight she had kept it. And as the applause washed over her, Eliza felt something inside her shift, awaken, burn. Not just the memory of who she had been, but the possibility of who she might still become. "You didn't know I wouldn't fail." "You didn't either," he said. "But you didn't." She thought of the laughter that had cut her in the aisle, of the way silence had replaced it once the note left her mouth. She could feel the exact moment her fear had cracked, like ice giving way to river. "Why?" she asked. "Why did you do it? Why me?" "A selfish reason," Jonathan said, almost amused at himself. "My soprano dropped out this afternoon. The premiere is in 5 days, and the hall is sold out through the week. She lost her nerve, or her faith, or her taste for my temperament, I don't know. But I needed a voice, not a body with a throat. A voice. I would have postponed, but I can't." He looked past Eliza for a second, and she saw behind his eyes the scrim of obligations, contracts, donors, a dozen moving parts bolted to a calendar. "Then you hummed." Her stomach pitched, as if the floor had tilted. The world rearranged itself. "You think I could sing in a premiere? In 5 days?" He almost smiled. "I think you have to decide whether you'd like to try." Panic fluttered its wings against the cage of her ribs. I'm not. I sell flowers. You sang the roof off my theater. You're not defined by what you carry in a basket." He leaned forward. "Here's what I see. Technique that's rusted but not ruined. Breath support that's endured, God knows how. A musicality you didn't get from a street corner. And something I can't teach. I need that something. What if I fail?" The words were out before she could dress them up as practical questions. Naked, they were honest. What if I become tonight's fluke? What if I drown on the second note? "Then we fail together," he said simply. "And if we fail together, I promise you the world will still know your name for the right reason." Eliza's eyes burned again, but not from stage lights now. She blinked hard and saw the backstage corridor fade into the memory of another hallway. The conservatory's marbled echo, her father's steps slow beside her, his cough a metronome they pretended wasn't keeping time. He had said then, "You belong here." She had believed him until the bills had convinced her otherwise. "Why can't you postpone?" she asked, grasping at logistics to keep from floating away. "Because the grant that built this season's commission cycle expires with the calendar," he said, practical now. "Because the piece was written for a voice that could fold a city into prayer and release it as something braver. Because the donors need miracles to justify what art asks of their wallets. And because," he hesitated, then shrugged at himself, "because I'm not good at waiting once I see the thing I have been looking for." A radio crackled somewhere near the fly system. Someone said, "Hold the trap until we reset." The stage manager reappeared with a clipboard and a wary look at Eliza's bare feet. "We'll need to clear," she told Jonathan softly, apologetic and awed all at once. "Press are sniffing around the lobby already. They'll want a quote." "Tell them the music spoke," Jonathan said dryly, and I was polite enough to listen. Then to Eliza, "Come to rehearsal tomorrow, 11 a.m. Here." He stood, tugging something from his inner jacket pocket, a stiff rectangle. He scribbled a number on the back. Text tonight if you change your mind. Eliza took the card. The embossed letters spelled out a name that could open doors in any concert hall in the country. It felt heavier than it should have. I don't have. She glanced down at her dress, her basket, the immediate declaration of her life. There were so many endings to that sentence. Proper clothes, a score, money for a taxi, a voice coach, a plan. We'll handle what can be handled, he said, catching the flurry of lack in one sweep. Bring yourself and your lungs. He started away, then turned back. You know Ave Maria, but this is not Schubert. It's mine. Text me your range tonight. Where you feel strongest. Where you're afraid. Be honest. We have 5 days to build a cathedral from scaffolding. He was gone before she could say thank you. The stage manager hovered another moment, as if unsure whether to offer more water or a map out of the labyrinth. Eliza stood, the basket bumping her knee, and found that the ground did not rock after all. She could walk. The applause had quieted to a rumor at her back. The theater had returned to the business of being a theater, which meant it was already forgetting that a miracle had just threaded itself through its rafters. Outside, the night had cooled. The Hale Theater's awning poured light onto the sidewalk like a spill that couldn't be mopped. People clustered beneath it, their conversation fizzing. Who was she? And did you see? And I haven't. The air smelled of rain that hadn't fallen. She tucked the card into the inner pocket of her dress, where once she might have carried a folded page of sheet music, and slipped into the river of strangers. Each step carried her away from thunder and back into anonymity's steady hum. The clink of coins in her basket sounded ridiculous now, like props from school play. At the end of the block, she stopped beneath the neon stoop of a deli and counted the bills and quarters by habit. Her hands moved automatically. Her mind stared elsewhere. At the stage, at the way the audience had risen, at Jonathan's voice saying, I needed a voice. She had $7 and some coins. Enough for a grilled cheese and coffee. She ordered at the counter and found a seat by the window. She didn't take out her phone to text Jonathan yet. She took it out to stare at the photo on the lock screen. Her father with his arm around her shoulders, a church picnic in the background, the sky U.S. flag blue. He was grinning at the camera like he had just found a secret path through a forest and couldn't wait to show her. Her throat closed and opened again. She breathed through it. You look like somebody just told you you're famous, the cashier said when he brought over the plate, teasing without malice. Somebody just told me I might be, Eliza said before she could soft-pedal the truth. It sounded ridiculous in her mouth. She laughed at herself. I don't know. Well, in that case, grilled cheese is on the house, he said gallantly. We like to support local legends before the world claims them. She would have argued, but the smell of melted cheddar made her dizzy with gratitude. Thank you, she whispered, and ate slowly, each bite a truce with the future. By the time she stepped back onto the sidewalk, the city had edged past midnight and into the hour when delivery trucks murmured like big animals and the tipsy laughter thinned to a finer thread. She walked east, then south, toward the shelter where she sometimes slept when a friend's couch was taken. She could hear herself humming. Not Avenue Maria this time, but something unfamiliar, an arc of melody that might have been Jonathan's, a staircase she hadn't climbed yet. Half a block from the shelter, she stopped beneath a street lamp and texted the number on the card. This is Eliza. Soprano. Strong G3. C6. Float to D6 on a good day. Weakest around the passaggio when I'm tired. Fear lives at the top when breath is short. Better at legato than fireworks. I can sight read with time, but I learn faster by ear. I haven't sung in rooms like yours in 3 years. I want to try. She stared at the words, worried they were too much, too honest, then hit send before fear could edit her. The message went blue. The night went on breathing. The reply came faster than she expected. Good. Honesty buys time. 11 a.m. Bring shoes. We will scare the fear out of the top together. Eliza smiled into the blue glow. She kept walking. Morning broke the city open like a soft egg. She woke with the shelter's hum around her. The rustle of plastic bags, the distant hiss of shower, the thick snore of a woman who had fallen asleep sitting up. Eliza folded the blanket, thanked the attendant, and stepped out into a sky that had remembered how to be blue. She hadn't brought much. The dress she had worn, a sweater, her phone, her father's lock-screen grin. She checked the time. 8:02 a.m. She had 3 hours to become someone who belonged on the other side of a loading dock. She took the subway uptown and got out one stop early to walk. Movement settled her. The city's morning smelled like coffee, hot bread, and last night's rain catching sunlight in the seams of the sidewalks. She passed joggers, a man arguing sweetly with a pit bull about which direction to take, a nanny pushing the world's happiest baby. Normal life. She wanted to drink it and save it in jars. At a thrift store 2 blocks from the theater, she found a pair of black flats for $6. They fit like an apology, tight at the toe, but kinder than bare feet. She paid and left the basket. She didn't need it now. Carefully, without ceremony, she carried the basket to the trash bin behind the store and set it gently on top. It had been her livelihood, her shield, her shame. It deserved gentleness, even as she parted from it. For a moment, she stood with her hand on the handle, an absurd little funeral. Then she let go. By the time she reached the stage door, she felt hollowed out and ready. A security guard in a navy polo lifted his chin in greeting. "You're the one," he said. "I'm trying to be," she said. He chuckled and buzzed her in. The smell of backstage was different in daylight, cleaner somehow, the dust and history less smoky and more sun-bleached. A stagehand pointed her toward a rehearsal room on the second floor. She counted the steps and kept her breath steady. The door was propped open with a case of bottled water. Inside, a pianist was warming up with scales that streamed like beads on a string. Jonathan stood at the far end of the room, talking to a woman with iron-gray hair and the posture of a dancer. He looked up when Eliza entered, and the quick flare of recognition in his face steadied her more than any pep talk could have. "Eliza," he said, "this is Mara Dell." Mara turned. She was not what Eliza had expected. There was no softness to her, but no cruelty either. Her eyes missed nothing. They took Eliza in from Crown to Borrowed Flats and back again without judgment. "You sang last night," Mara said matter-of-factly. "You caused me to lose an hour of sleep, which is rare." The corner of her mouth quirked. "Let's see what we have." "Mara is a vocal coach," Jonathan said. "She trained the last 3 sopranos who survived my compositions." "Survived," Mara echoed dryly and shook Eliza's hand. Her palm was warm and firm. "Warm up. Gently. If you break yourself in the first 10 minutes, we'll strap you to a chair and read poetry at you for 2 hours as punishment." The pianist, Rafi, he offered, shifted from scales to a neutral arpeggio. Eliza stepped to the center of the room. There were no chandeliers here, no audience to warp her into a story. Just sunlight, a piano, 3 people, and the memory of thunder. She began with hums, then lip trills, then open vowels. The room answered her differently than the hall had. It wasn't built to glorify, it was built to listen. She found where the notes sat after years of hiding in her chest. She found where fear had set up house, the thin membrane between E5 and G5, where breath had to be a bridge, not a wish. "Good," Mara said. "Your instrument remembers. Don't bully it. Invite it." Jonathan listened from the corner, arms folded, mouth a straight line. He was not the center of the room. He was a hinge on which it swung. "Show her the phrase," he told Rafi. Rafi lifted his hands. The first measure shocked Eliza. Modern, but somehow ancient. A line that curved like a question mark scrawled across a map. It asked for delicacy and nerve. It would punish both extra and lack. She closed her eyes once to hear it, and then opened them to meet it. "Text?" she asked. "No text," Jonathan said. "Vocalize." The whole piece lives between vowel and breath. It's called Untitled City. The soprano is the street. The orchestra is everything that wants to own her and can't. Eliza felt the title crawl under her skin. "I could try. Try's all any of us get," Mara said. And then suddenly we're doing. They began with one phrase. Eliza let the line rise, felt the passaggio approach like a narrow bridge, moved over it without looking down. Her first attempt was cautious. Pinned to the staff like a butterfly, she was afraid to hurt. Mara stepped closer. Again, she said gently. But trust your ribs. Trust the floor. Let her back be a wing, not a wall. You're holding the sound at the lips. That's what happens when you sing for people who are close enough to laugh. This hall is not a subway car. Eliza nodded. Again, she let the breath drop deeper. Let the vowel form in the cave of her mouth. Let the sound ride the column of air. The line held. It even shimmered at its crest. Jonathan's eyes softened a fraction. Again, Mara said, but now remember hunger. Not the kind that hurts your belly. The kind that remembers it has been hungry and survived. Sing like a woman who ate thunder last night and learn it tasted like salt and sugar. Eliza laughed, startled into ease, and on the next try, something opened. The phrase arced the way Rafi had shown it, but carried her own history now, a river that had scoured its bed and polished stones. Mara's shoulders loosened. Jonathan's arms fell to his sides. Good, he said, the word is small metal. Now the second phrase will trip you if you get arrogant. Rafi played it. It was a knot of intervals that could turn to mud if she pushed. She didn't push. She stepped carefully at first, then confidently, then almost not at all, letting it carry its own weight. She faltered near the top. Fear flickered its little lantern. Mara clucked. Breathe before you need to, she said. Ask the air to stay. Don't beg it not to leave. They worked for an hour. Eliza learned the skeleton of the first section and the muscle memory of two difficult corners. Sweat prickled her spine. Between attempts, Mara fed her small, precise instructions. Release the tongue. Unhook the jaw. Inhale as if smelling fresh bread. Jonathan fed her nothing and everything. Silence where she needed space. One-line approvals like stepping stones across a flooded street. At last, Mara lifted both hands like a traffic cop. We stop now, she said. You're not a miracle if you're broken by lunch. We had the orchestra in the afternoon. The orchestra? Eliza's mouth went dry. They won't bite, Rafi said kindly. Well, the brass might if you flatter them. Jonathan checked his watch. Break until 2. There's soup in the green room. And fruit. And a ghastly number of muffins that looked like they were baked during the Clinton administration. Eliza laughed, the sound giddy in her chest. I don't have. She gestured at her dress. Should I wear? We're clean and comfortable, Mara said. And shoes you can stand in. The rest we'll ignore. In the hallway, Jonathan fell into step beside Eliza. There'll be press sniffing at the door when you leave this afternoon, he said, not unkindly. People like a story. They like to place bets. If anyone asks who you are, tell them you're a musician. Not a miracle. Miracles become headlines. Musicians become work. Eliza tucked that sentence away like a talisman. What if they ask where I came from? Tell them the street, he said. It will make a better paragraph than upstairs. The green room smelled faintly of coffee and carpet. A battered couch bore the scars of decades of nerves. Eliza chose soup, carried it to a corner chair, and cradled the paper bowl like a small creature. She didn't know where to put her face or her gratitude. Musicians drifted in and out. Some glanced at her with curiosity. Others didn't bother to disguise their assessment. A violinist with hair, like wildfire, perched on the couch arm and said, You're the soprano who fell from the ceiling last night. More like from the balcony, Eliza said. I was selling gum. Even better, the violinist said, delighted. I'm Anya. If the clarinets get uppity, stand near me. I have a bow and excellent aim. Eliza found herself smiling again, this time from somewhere deep, not just the surface. The orchestra wasn't a monolith. It was a city with alleys and cafes. She could live here a while. After lunch, the room changed. The orchestra assembled piece by piece, tuning with a ragged, beautiful chaos that always sounded to Eliza like bees deciding how to be a hive. She stood at the front with the score Jonathan had given her, a clean copy that smelled like new paper and possibility. Mara stood just off to the side, arms folded like scaffolding. Jonathan walked to the podium. He didn't raise his arms yet. He looked at his musicians the way a cartographer looks at a map he has drawn and now must travel, knowing every mountain and valley, fearing every weather. This is Eliza Maren, he said. He didn't explain her. He didn't have to. We're going from letter strings. Make it less camelot and more streetlight. You know what I mean. Brass. Try not to be the ocean during the first 4 bars. You'll get your moment to drown us later. A smattering of chuckles. Winds, I love you, don't leave me. He lifted his hands. The room inhaled as a single animal. The first downbeat cracked the world open. The piece called Untitled City wasn't polite. It was a tall woman with her hair pinned up, shoulders bare, walking home at midnight and daring anyone to mistake her for prey. The strings laid the pavement. The percussion set far off, thunder rolling. The winds were the shifting of traffic lights, the not-quite silence between cabs. The brass rumbled like a train in a tunnel. Eliza waited for her cue. Her hands were steady. The old barricade between breath and fear had retreated a few steps. She thought of her father, sitting in row 3, coughing into his handkerchief, smiling like it meant nothing. She thought of the audience last night, rising like a field of wheat to the wind. She raised her gaze to a point above the back row of violins and sang. The first phrase slid into the orchestral fabric as if it had been cut to fit it. The second found a thread of clarinet and braided itself. She felt the city rise around her, its scaffolds, its graffiti, its small joys. At bar 19, the narrow bridge came. She crossed it. At bar 28, the top note flashed its little knife. She kissed it and stepped away uncut. Mara didn't nod. Mara was a lighthouse, steady, making sure no one crashed. Rafi flashed her a micro-smile from the piano he'd migrated to for the second section. They reached letter C. The brass got their wave. Eliza stood on the shore and didn't flee. She let them thunder past and sang afterward with the sound of rain after storm. The room, the city, the day, all of it focused to a point so sharp it felt like relief. At the end of the section, Jonathan dropped his hands. Silence fell not like a curtain, but like a breath held. Then the room exhaled. Anya hooped. Well, she said, if the donors wanted entertainment, we've given them religion. A bassoonist muttered something about goosebumps into his reed. The trumpet section looked indignant that they had been complimented with restraint and then pleased that they had managed it. Jonathan looked at Eliza. Not through her, not past her. At her. Again, he said, voice quiet and certain. From A. The city doesn't become itself with one pass. They did it again, and again. Each time, the piece became more itself, and Eliza became less afraid of it. She learned where to place the breath the way one learns where to step on a path with loose stones. She learned where to stand inside the sound to let it hold her up. At one point, she tried to push, and the line punished her. She smiled at the sting and did it right the next time. Mistakes didn't bloom into shame. They crumpled under the weight of work. By the 4th run, the room smelled like effort. Sweat, rosin, the warm tin of horn, the human salt of focus. Eliza's throat felt kissed raw, not bruised. Mara handed her a bottle of water at a break and said, You are not a myth, which is perfect. Myths can't be tuned. Can I really do this in 5 days? Eliza asked because hope needed something to lean on besides adrenaline. You've already done it for 4 minutes, Mara said. We stack minutes. We don't swallow hours whole. Jonathan called them back. The brass grinned like children told to put down their candy and pick up their vegetables. The cellos stroked the opening, making pavement. Eliza sang. The city stood up. For the first time since she had left the conservatory, she felt a present future inside her. A corridor with doors she might open, not just windows to watch other lives through. After rehearsal, the room broke into clusters. The principal oboist asked if the high F at the end could be floated like a question mark instead of nailed like a decree. Jonathan considered, then deferred to a quick experiment. Eliza floated it. The oboist grinned and clapped his reed case. Mara's eyebrows made a brief assent. Approval scaled in millimeters. Anya gave Eliza a conspirator's thumbs up. Eliza, Jonathan called, a word. He led her to the corner where the sunlight pooled. I told you there would be press. He nodded toward the door. Through the small pane of wire glass, Eliza could see a clutch of people with cameras and careful haircuts. I'll run interference. But they'll want a quote from you. About what? About being discovered in an aisle, and whether I'm a madman. He looked briefly, wickedly pleased with that notion. Say little. Save your voice for the work. Let them make their story. We will make ours. The door opened. A woman with chic glasses and an expression that tried to be both friendly and predatory slipped inside. Mr. Hale, she said brightly. Just a second. And Ms. Maren, is it? Eliza? Could we? Jonathan's publicist materialized from thin air like a guardian spirit. 2 questions, she said. No personal details. No last names for family. No speculation. We're in rehearsal. Eliza stood straighter and felt suddenly, absurdly protective of the thing they had made in the last 2 hours. I can say what we did, she said carefully, but not what it means. The journalist blinked, recalibrating. How did it feel last night? Going from selling gum to a standing ovation? It felt like remembering something I'd promised not to forget, Eliza said. The sentence surprised her. She watched it land, saw the reporter's eyes widen at the quotability, and wished she'd made it worse on purpose. Too late. And Mr. Hale? Is she replacing your soprano for Friday's premiere? She is singing, Jonathan said, and left the word without ornament. She is a musician. That is the only replacement I care to discuss. After the cameras blinked and retreated, Eliza sighed out a laugh she hadn't meant to keep. You really are a madman. Occupational hazard, he said. So is hope. They were alone for a moment before the orchestra filtered back. In that small pocket of quiet, Eliza felt the old familiar itch at the back of her mind, the one that meant a question had been sitting there trembling, waiting for courage. Why me? She asked again softer. You said you needed a voice. There are 100 sopranos in this city who would kill for this chance, who have resumes and gowns, and she gestured at herself, at the thrift store flats, at the sweater with a loose thread. Jonathan studied her as if she were a score he was still annotating. I have heard 100 sopranos in this city, he said. Most of them sing me the outline of what I wrote. Last night you sang me the inside of it without knowing what it was. That is not a thing I can manufacture with coaching. That is not even a thing I can ask for without sounding like a lunatic. His gaze softened. And maybe I'm tired of rooms where everyone knows exactly what they're doing. Maybe I needed someone who would stand in front of the storm and choose to taste it. Eliza thought of the basket on the trash bin, of her father in row 3, of the child on Broadway who had smiled when her hum slipped out. She nodded. Okay, she said quietly. Then teach me the storm. They worked until 6. By then, the piece had transformed from a structure to a body. It had breath and a heartbeat and an ache in its shoulder where the brass leaned too long, but promised to stop tomorrow. The last run of the day felt like walking through a neighborhood she no longer feared getting lost in. The final note hung like a streetlight's steady glow. Silence fell. Someone whistled softly. The room loosened. Again tomorrow, Mara said. Sleep. Steam if you can. No shouting at basketball games. No whispering either. Whispering is the devil. That's true, Anya said solemnly. I whispered once and lost a week to superstition. Eliza packed the score into a tote that the library had offered her, as if it were a crown. She said goodnight more times than she had in a year. She stepped into the early evening and found the city tuned to a key that matched her bones. Her phone pinged before she reached the corner. A number she didn't recognize. The message read, We went to school together. Sophie Klein. I heard. Coffee? Eliza stopped. The sidewalk flowed around her like a river parting for a rock. Sophie Klein. First chair at every juried recital. A soprano whose voice was as precise as a scalpel and almost as warm. At the Conservatory, Sophie had been both friend and rival, a person Eliza measured herself against and sometimes found wanting. Her message dredged up nights of practicing until dawn, the taste of envy like tin on the tongue, kindnesses that had felt like ambushes and genuine ones that had surprised them both. Eliza typed, tomorrow? After rehearsal? And hesitated. She erased it and wrote, Yes. Tonight. 8. The deli across from Hale. See you, Sophie replied, and Eliza felt the old tightness in her throat that had nothing to do with singing. The deli was brighter at night. The cashier who had gifted her grilled cheese was still on shift and greeted her like a regular. Eliza chose tea. She needed her hands to hold something without chewing it. Sophie arrived at 8:05, punctual in the way that meant to be unthreateningly late. She had the same dancer's posture she'd worn at 19, hair sleek and eyes sharper than she tried to make them. Eliza. She said the name like she knew it better than Eliza did. Congratulations. Thank you. Eliza meant it. She meant to mean it. Sit. They sat. For a few minutes. They were two women who had once been girls in the same practice rooms, comparing schedules and weather because other topics had teeth. I saw the video, Sophie said finally. It's everywhere. The one of you on stage. You are. She broke off, frustrated by adjectives. It was good. It was a night, Eliza said. Today was work. Friday is reality. You're taking the premiere? There was hunger in Sophie's question. Not malice. Hunger like a runner watching a race they'd been training for. I'm trying to, Eliza said. There's trying, and there's doing. Sophie nodded. Something in her face softened then, as if a piece of armor had slipped. Listen, she said, leaning in. I need to tell you something because I think you should hear it from me before you hear it in some version mangled by joy or jealousy. She took a breath. I was offered it. Last week. The premiere. Hale called me first. Eliza's spine cooled. And? I turned it down. Sophie grimaced at herself. The money was good. The exposure would have been better. But he wanted something. She searched for the words, looking not at Eliza, but at the space just to the right of her face where focus felt less dangerous. He wanted the city inside the voice, not the polish. I can do what he writes. All of it. I can nail it to the wall. But he wanted to risk something. I didn't want to. Not this month. Not with the Lincoln Center audition next week. I chose the thing that looks better on paper. Eliza exhaled. The jealousy she had expected didn't come. Only a quiet understanding settled, like dust and sunlight. Thank you for telling me, she said, even if it makes tonight feel new in a way that hurts. Sophie half smiled. I know you think I'm a machine, but I did love you at school. In the way we love our reflections and our rivals and the parts of ourselves we can't carry alone. She sipped her coffee and set it down carefully. Also, the soprano who quit yesterday, rumor says she quit because she thought she couldn't hold the audience's attention with no words. She panicked. If you panic, call me. I'm good at talking someone off a ledge. Are you warning me off? Eliza asked lightly. I'm warning you toward. Sophie shrugged. You were better than me at one thing I never forgiven you for. What's that? Making people believe a note is a story and not a trick. Sophie's gaze was clean and painful. If you can survive this week, you might never have to sell a rose again. Eliza smiled then, the kind that brings salt to the corners of the mouth. I threw the basket away, she said softly. This morning. Good, Sophie said, and looked relieved like it was a surgery she had watched from behind glass. Then promise me something selfish. Anything, Eliza said, startled into truth. In 10 years, when some girl like us asks you for coffee because she's scared and impressed and pissed off, say yes. Eliza laughed. I said yes today, didn't I? Sophie clinked her coffee cup to Eliza's tea like a toast. Then, I'm already paying it forward. They left with awkward hugs and real ones layered like clothes against weather. Outside, the air smelled like the beginning of summer. Eliza walked toward the shelter again, then turned left instead and kept walking. Her legs wanted to move, as if the orchestra had wound them and let them go. When she reached the bridge over the small park near her old subway stop, she paused. A man with a guitar sat on a bench, playing something that sounded like a memory she couldn't place. He nodded at her. She nodded back. He played softer. She hummed without thinking, then stopped, embarrassed. He smiled as if she had handed him the missing corner of a puzzle. You sing, he said. Sometimes, she said. Sing now, he said gently, even if it's only for the leaves. Eliza looked at the trees, at their dark outlines against the city's pale haze, at the way their leaves shook without any apparent wind like they were applauding without hands, and she sang. Not Avenue Maria, not Untitled City, just a string of vowels and breath. A lullaby for a place that had held her and tried to shake her off, and maybe, if she did this right, would welcome her home. Her phone buzzed. She finished the line and checked it. Jonathan again. Tomorrow 10, not 11. Donors coming. Or whatever feels like honesty. Bring your fear and we'll take it apart. She typed back. I threw away my basket. Is that honest enough? A pause. Then, it's a start. She slept badly, but woke strong. Morning unspooled. Rehearsal felt like returning to a conversation with a lover you still barely knew but already trusted. They tightened the second section and agreed to float the final F like a question. Mara made her sip honeyed water between runs. Anya made faces at the trombones when they tried to eat the room. The piece became, There's the Way a City Becomes Yours. Not all at once, but with the accumulation of corner stores and favorite benches, and the perfect time to cross a street before the light changes. Between takes, Eliza caught her reflection in a window. A woman in a thrift store sweater and flats, jaw unclenched, eyes a shade braver. She lifted her hand and didn't recognize the gesture as a wave goodbye. It felt like a hello. On the third day, Jonathan handed her a small box with tissue paper folded like origami. A friend of the theater heard your story, he said. She has taste and a closet that could armor an army. If this feels like a costume, we'll send it back. If it feels like you, wear it Friday. It was a dress the color of smoke just before it forgets the fire. It fell simply, asked nothing fancy of the body, and promised movement where movement would be graceful. Eliza touched the fabric like it might bite, and then smiled. It feels like a door, not a disguise, she said, surprising herself again with the neatness of the words. Thank her for me. Tell her yourself when she corner you at intermission, Jonathan said dryly. She will ask whether your vowels are sustainable. On the fourth day, the fear that had been sitting quietly at the back of the rehearsal room stood up and tried to make a scene. It happened on a high, exposed passage where the line moved like a tightrope over silence. Eliza missed it. Then she missed it on purpose to test a breath that wouldn't cooperate. Then she missed it again and felt the old panic creep up her spine with sly fingers. Mara crossed the room in 2 steps. Stop, she said not unkindly. Say out loud. I'm not my last note. Eliza swallowed. I'm not my last note, she said, and felt foolish and then less so. Again, Mara said, and mean it enough that you'll insult me if you don't. I'm not my last note, Eliza said, and this time the sentence made a little room inside her chest where breath could sit. Now sing the phrase like it owes you money, Mara said. Not like you owe an apology. Eliza sang. The note held. The bridge didn't crack. The silence on the other side welcomed her like a surprise party that had been planning itself for years. Good, Mara said. Now carry that arrogance carefully. It's a candle in a windy alley. The orchestra applauded, small and sincere, the way only people who understand the exact weight of a thing can clap. Jonathan didn't. He smiled, which, she realized, was worth more in this room. After they broke for the day, Eliza checked her phone. 100 messages she hadn't seen pulsed like a heart. People she didn't know who had seen her and wanted to tell her they had. People she had known who wanted to remind her that they had once known her. An email from the Conservatory's Alumni Relations Office asking, sweetly predatory, whether she might be willing to give a quote about how the school nurtured talent from all walks of life. She wrote back, I'll let you know after Friday. She felt petty and then justified and then nothing at all. Her past and future were on speaking terms, but not yet friendly. That night, she met Sophie again and didn't flinch when a photographer outside snapped their picture. He's going to write, Rivals Reunite in a caption, Sophie said, rolling her eyes. Let him, Eliza agreed, and took a fry off Sophie's plate without asking. On the 5th morning, the city felt like a held breath. The Hale Theater's backstage buzzed with flowers sent from people who wanted to be part of the story and fruit baskets sent from people who wished they knew how. Eliza warmed up alone in a practice room for 10 minutes. Hums, trills, open vowels, breath like a tide. She could hear the audience gathering on the other side of the wall, the rolling, expensive murmur of expectation. She could smell perfume and fear and dust and hope. Mara adjusted the neckline of the smoke-colored dress and nodded once to herself, like a scientist satisfied her experiment would not explode immediately. You look like music, she said. Go be it. Jonathan stood at the wings. He didn't touch Eliza. He didn't give a speech. He looked at her the way he had looked at the orchestra on the first day, like a map he was about to walk. "If you need a bail," he said calmly, "do it by bar 12 so the brass know to pretend it's their solo. If you forget you have lungs, look at Anya. She will breathe for you. If you remember everything and are terrified anyway, sing the first note." Eliza nodded. "What if I sing the first note and everything breaks?" "Then we will be brave inside the breaking," he said, "and the city will love us for it." She stepped onto the stage. The hall was a bowl full of stars. Time snipped itself into smaller pieces. The orchestra shimmered into tune and then into silence. Jonathan lifted his hands. The room inhaled. And somewhere in the dark, a man coughed in a way that was purely a man's cough and had nothing to do with memory. And yet Eliza felt her father's hand on her shoulder the way she had at 19, a weight that steadied. She looked past the lights to where row 3 might be and imagined a grin aimed at her like a dare. The first downbeat felt like a promise. She sang. The sound climbed her, and she climbed it. The hall became a place where time wasn't linear, but spiral, where a girl could be 19 and 22 and ancient and brand new in the space of a single vowel. The phrase she'd feared held. The note that had mocked her on Thursday bowed its head on Friday, like a horse accepting its rider. The orchestra breathed with her, and she breathed with it, and the audience forgot, briefly, to be made of people with separate lives. Somewhere in the second section, between the brass's delayed, drowning, and the woodwind's small domestic miracles, Eliza felt the thing that had been missing for 3 years click back into its socket. She sang like a person who knew where her home was, not because she had returned to an address, but because she had built a room inside her chest where her father could sit down and her fear could stand up, and both could keep their hands to themselves. The final F came. She floated it, not as a question mark that begged for mercy, but as the kind that opens a door. It hung there, companionable with the ceiling, and then dissolved into a silence that tasted like rain on the first warm night of the year. For a beat, the room was so quiet it felt like a held hand. And then the sound rose, unmistakable and unstoppable. People standing, people cheering, people remembering how to be a crowd in love with a moment. Eliza didn't cry. She smiled, big and reckless, and bowed to the orchestra first, then to the audience, then to the shadow of a man in row 3 who might have been anyone. Jonathan bowed, and, in a rare lapse of his own mythology, grinned like a boy who had stolen a pie and gotten away with it. Mara made a tiny motion with her head, almost invisible, a benediction no one else was invited to see. Backstage, chaos. Flowers. A woman in a gold jacket thrust a microphone toward Eliza and asked what it meant to be plucked from poverty by genius. Eliza sidestepped the trap politely. "It meant I met a room that wanted to listen," she said. "I try to be worth its patience." Sophie found her at the water cooler. Eyes bright and guilty with pride, she didn't try to hide. "I screamed on the high note," she confessed. "Anya told me to apologize to the oboe section for the ringing in their ears." Eliza laughed and cried at the same time. The two sounds braided easily. "Stay," she said to Sophie. "For the after. For whatever after is." "Of course," Sophie said, fierce. "I want to be here when your life trips over itself and gets up again." Hours later, after the donors had pressed hands and cameras had blinked and Anya had given an impromptu lecture on vibrato to a man who thought he knew what vibrato was, Eliza found a small bubble of quiet in a corridor that smelled like new paint. Jonathan stood there, leaning against the wall, the fatigue under his eyes suddenly decades old and gentle. "You were honest," he said simply. "I was scared," she replied. "Both can be true," he said. "Tomorrow you will wonder if it happened. Monday you will wonder if it can happen again. Tuesday you will realize you don't get to decide whether it happens. You only get to decide whether you show up for it." Eliza looked down at her thrift store flats. They had survived the night. She looked up. "I'll show up," she said, "even when the world forgets this. Especially then." Jonathan nodded. He pushed himself off the wall, and, in a gesture that might have been fatherly if it weren't so carefully devoid of ownership, touched her shoulder once. "Good night, Eliza Maren," he said. "Welcome home." She went outside into a city that had not changed and yet had. The Hale's awning still poured light. The street still held people with too many plans. But the air tasted like something she had earned rather than scraped. Across the street, the deli's cashier raised a hand and mimed a grilled cheese smile. Eliza raised a hand back. She didn't cross. Not yet. She wanted to walk, to let the night move through her and out the other side. On the corner, a man sold roses from a bucket, their petals already bruised. Eliza stopped. She bought one with money she had made with her voice. She lifted it to her face and breathed in the scent of something that dies and returns anyway. Busy night? The man asked, not recognizing her. Or maybe choosing not to. Grace comes in many disguises. Work, she said. Good work. She walked away, the rose a small flare in her hand. The city laid its hand on her shoulder the way her father had, steady, not pushing. She hummed, and this time nobody shushed her. They didn't even look. The street listened without needing to show its approval. At the bridge over the park, she stopped again and looked down. The leaves moved with a wind she couldn't feel. Somewhere a saxophone tried out a phrase that would become a song by the end of the summer. Somewhere a girl with a basket went to sleep a little earlier than usual, ignorant and safe in the way some hearts get to be safe for a little while. Eliza lifted her face to the halo of a streetlight and sang one last line, soft enough to be mistaken for breath, sure enough to be mistaken for prayer. Tomorrow would be work. The story would be wrestled by narratives until it was a shape strangers could agree to carry. But tonight belonged to the sound that had made the room stand up and the girl who had believed she could do it again if she kept choosing yes. She said a good night to the city under her breath, the way you do when you live with someone and you've learned their habits. Then she turned, and in shoes that still pinched and a dress that felt like a door, she walked home. The morning after the premiere arrived like someone had turned the city's dimmer switch up too high. Eliza woke before her alarm to a flood of light and a phone buzzing itself toward the edge of the nightstand. The shelter had granted her a separate cubicle in the women's wing for the week, a kindness paid for, the attendant hinted, by a friend of the theater. She didn't ask who. She just lay there for a long minute, breathing, letting the world seep in. Her throat felt strangely normal. Not raw, not blown. The work had held. She smiled to herself, then flinched at another buzz. And another. The screen blinked and blinked. Unknown numbers, congratulations, heart emojis, 3 different morning shows, a message from a blogger asking if she'd been a plant, a question about whether Jonathan Hale's discovery had been staged. She sat up. The small square of mirror on the opposite wall showed a woman with sleep-creased cheek and eyes still drunk on something like joy. The reflection steadied her and then annoyed her. She swung her legs to the floor, put them into the thrift store flats waiting like loyal dogs, and stood. Steam from the communal shower curled like prayer. She bathed her throat in it and remembered Mara's warning. No whispering either. Whispering is the devil. She wanted to tell someone, anyone, everything. Instead, she hummed softly into the steam, felt her ribs settle like a house after a party. By the time she stepped into the street, Manhattan had already written the morning in chalk on every sidewalk. Washed blue sky, trucks beeping in reverse, bakery air fat with butter. A delivery man looked at her twice, as if trying to place a face he'd seen blown up on a screen. She pulled her sweater tighter and walked toward the Hale on a line that her body seemed to know without commands. The theater's stage door guard grinned like they were conspirators. Ms. Maren, he said, mock formal. Eliza, she said, unable to give away the new name they were building for her and unwilling to accept it yet, either. Inside, the green room had become a florist's. Bouquets everywhere. Notes pinned to petals. Some from strangers. Some from names that turned Eliza's stomach over with a weird weight of fame. The chair of a foundation she'd heard mentioned in odd whispers at the Conservatory. A pop star whose high C lived mostly in software, but whose kindness, it turned out, didn't. There was even one from her old professor, Dr. Ruiz, 2 sentences in a hand she recognized instantly. The room finally heard what I knew. Come home if you want to. But also, don't, if your home is elsewhere now. A low whistle sounded from the doorway. Anya leaned on the frame, hair curly and slightly damp, the strap of her violin case slicing diagonally across her chest. You turned the city into a choir last night, she said. I took the long way home to listen to the after echo. It felt like walking on a plate still hot from the oven. Eliza said, the oddness of her own metaphors making her laugh. Anya nodded toward the flowers. Take the ones without thorns, she advised. The donors like metaphors too much. They'll stab you by accident and call it fate. Mara arrived with a thermos the size of a baton. She handed it to Eliza without ceremony. Honey and something disgusting, she said. Don't ask. Drink. Eliza drank. It tasted like loyalty and a cough drop got married. Press at 10, Jonathan said, appearing as if he'd stepped out of the wall, eyes already tracking 3 problems at once. 15 minutes. No more. Then you're mine for 2 hours. We're writing the second performance before the high wears off. He tilted his head at her. How's your head? Floaty, she said. In a good way. How's your voice? In a room, she said. It doesn't feel like the room is on fire. Good, he said, satisfied. Fame sets fires in the wrong places. Let's keep it out of your lungs. They did the press in a small rehearsal studio that had been staged to look casual and in the middle of art. Music stands at rakish angles. A stool with a stray scarf draped over it, as if inspiration were a person who had just stepped out to take a call. The journalist with sheet glasses from earlier had multiplied into 5 more with microphones, and a producer with a timer app. Was this all some brilliant marketing stunt? A man with a square jaw asked, as if he were bored with the question and with being alive. No, Jonathan said dryly. People are not stunts. Music isn't a press release. It was a moment. We responded to it with work. Eliza, a woman in a cheerful blazer, leaned in. How did it feel? Like being asked a question I'd been waiting my whole life to answer, Eliza said. She heard how rehearsed it sounded and wished for mess. And then like work, she added quickly. Like breathing while someone holds a mirror to your face to make sure you're actually doing it. Were you planted? Square Jaw insisted. No, Eliza said. I came to sell roses and gum. I left for the job. She shrugged. New York does that sometimes. Are you concerned, another voice chimed in, that this narrative street vendor to star is being exploited? That your poverty is being turned into a brand? Eliza blinked. The question wasn't unfair. It just wanted her to bleed where a paper cut had been. I'm concerned, she said slowly, with doing right by the music and by the people who have to live under the headlines I didn't ask for. She thought of the women at the shelter, the cashier who'd given her grilled cheese, the saxophonist in the park. If any of this can be turned into something they can use, free tickets, a workshop, a meal, I'd like to help do that. If it can't, then I'd like to keep the noise from drowning out the work. Mara's eyes flickered, approval subtle as a cat's blink. Jonathan's mouth did that half smile that meant good. Now back to rehearsal. After the press fled to write copy and drink coffee, they worked. The second night's performance needed to be as alive as the first without tasting of leftovers. Mara sharpened a few corners. Rafi stitched a seam where the piano wanted to elbow the clarinet. The brass practiced not being the ocean until it was their turn to drown everyone again. At letter D, Jonathan said, the percussion has to sound less like thunder and more like the subway, pretending it isn't a river. Can we do that? The percussionist with a beanie tugged at a snare with reverence, as if coaxing a child to whisper. They ran the arc twice. Eliza's voice held, and so did her mind. But between phrases, she felt the other city gathering. Emails, a text from a number labeled Aunt Lila. She half remembered from childhood. An invitation from a philanthropic gala to share her inspiring story between the speeches and the raffle. The distraction annoyed her, then scared her. At lunch, she ducked into a stairwell and answered the text from Lila. I'm in New York. Saw you on TV in the laundromat. The next, proud of you, kid. Your dad would be impossible right now. Call me if you want. No pressure. Love from Ohio. Eliza pressed the phone to her chest like it could give her a hug, and then called. They talked for 16 minutes. Lila's voice was a porch light. I knew you'd find your way back, she said. You can go in any door you want, but you are always going to end up in a room with music. Eliza didn't realize she was crying until a tear hit her wrist. She laughed through it. I thought I'd buried it. Some things are perennials, Lila said matter-of-factly. You forget to water them, and they still come back out of spite. Now, do you have shoes? Do you have someone to feed you soup? Do you have protection from people who think fame is a personality type? I have shoes, Eliza said. Soup. A coach who will fight anyone. A composer who is both terrifying and kind. Good, Lila said. Call me if you need the blunt instrument of Midwestern common sense. When Eliza returned to the green room, a man in a too shiny suit was waiting with a business card that announced him as a talent manager in a font that tried too hard. Eliza, he beamed. We should talk. We can package the narrative. Merchandise. A single within 48 hours. You've and a DJ in a mashup of Ave Maria and some urban texture. No, Mara said from the doorway, in a tone that made the fluorescent lights flicker. We're working. It's a free country, the man sniffed. And I represent 3 Billboard. You represent traffic accidents, Jonathan said, appearing at her shoulder. If you text her again, I will compose something at you that only dogs can hear. The man left a brochure anyway. Eliza threw it away without drama and felt a new kind of strength. The kind that says no because yes is already taken. The second performance was steadier than the first and more dangerous in the way that comfort is dangerous. Eliza made herself court risk. She opened one phrase like a window in the rain, rounded a vowel into a tenderness that might have snapped if she'd pressed a breath too hard. The audience stood again. Not as loudly, maybe, but sincerely. She felt the difference and preferred it. Not shock, but agreement. Not a miracle, but a promise kept. By Sunday, the city had turned her into 2 kinds of story, the fairy tale and the fraud. A long article on an arts blog suggested the discovery had been choreographed to juice ticket sales. A thread on a classical music forum debated whether a street singer belonged on a premiere at all, while men with usernames like Tenorman87 and Bach2 Basics took turns explaining breath support to one another. Another piece, kinder and more curious, dug up her conservatory scholarship and ran an old photo of her at 19, mouth open in a church basement, a microphone that cost $5 from a yard sale in her hand. She read none of it on Monday. Mara confiscated her phone for 6 hours. Your larynx can't read, the coach said, and your brain doesn't need ideas when it needs air. They worked on a small recital for Thursday afternoon, a donor event that Jonathan hated but performed like healthy penance. They want classics, he said, leafing through options. Give them Schubert and make them remember why classics exist. He glanced at her. You started this mess with Ave Maria. Finish them off with it properly. The choice worried her. Too on the nose. Too sentimental. But she wanted to sing it for her father, and for herself, as the person who had hummed it without permission in a theater aisle. She wanted to reclaim it from accident and give it intention. They booked a small hall, one of the Haleside rooms polished to a mirror. Rafi would accompany. The program would be short. A lilt of 4, a Bach aria that asked for hope and patience, a lullaby by a living composer that tasted like salt, and Ave Maria as the final cup of water. On Tuesday morning, Eliza walked past the old conservatory. Not because she meant to, because her feet found it. The building hadn't changed. Marble like teeth. Doors like verdicts. Students with instrument cases looking like declarations about the future. She stood across the street and watched herself at 19 walk through the doorway. Fierce, unprepared, loved broke. She expected to feel anger. She felt something else. A kind of mercy for the girl who had carried more than she knew and blamed herself for the gravity. She was about to turn away when Dr. Ruiz stepped out. He looked smaller without the podium. Gray hair, kind face, the same sweater shape. He saw her immediately and didn't pretend not to. He crossed the street, ignoring cabs with the authority of a man used to keeping time. Eliza, he said, and smiled with his whole face. I wondered if you'd come. I didn't mean to, she said. I think my shoes did. He laughed, then looked at her as if to make sure she wasn't cracked underneath the shine. You were splendid, not because of the ovation, because of the quiet after the last note. The quiet told me the room had been changed. She swallowed. I left, she said, uselessly, the old apology twitching like a startled animal. You did what was needed, he said, and you brought back more than you took away. He nodded toward the building. If you want a practice room at odd hours, I'll make the key card happen. No one should have to sing to a wall unless they mean it. She wanted to refuse out of loyalty to the hard way. She wanted to accept on behalf of the girl who had sold roses to get into rooms like this. Thank you, she said. I might take you up on that. Take me up on something else, he said, eyes warm and sharp. In a month, when the noise has changed flavor, come talk to the fourth years about the economics of art. They need to hear from someone who has counted coin for soup and applause for rent. They need to know no one is owed a stage, not even the deserving. I will, she said. I want to. He squeezed her arm once and left her with that in traffic, which somehow mattered less for a few seconds. Wednesday night, the shelter held a community dinner. The director asked if Eliza would say a few words and then corrected herself. Not sing. We don't want to compromise your voice. Just, if you want to tell them it gets better. Eliza looked at the faces, tired, suspicious, kind, young, older than time, and felt ashamed at the phrase gets better like it was a chain you could pull to raise the blinds. It gets different, she said instead. And sometimes different is better. Sometimes it's just different. But even when you think your voice is gone, your voice is in your body. They can't take that. Not the person who left. Not the person who didn't show up. Not the person who laughed. It's yours. She paused. If anyone wants to come to a concert tomorrow at lunchtime, I have 20 seats I can get you into. Free. No dress code. Just ears and breath. A woman named Carla asked the only real question. Will there be sandwiches? I will make sure there are sandwiches, Eliza said, and texted Anya. We need sandwiches for 20, and probably 30. And for God's sake, coffee. Anya, I will raid the percussion budget. Bread is a drum by other means. Thursday noon arrived with rain like a gray curtain that the city tugged at impatiently. The small hall filled early, donors and pearls, a sprinkling of journalists elbowing Grace into the corners, 3 students in hoodies, Sophie in the back with a scarf pulled high, 15 women and 5 men from the shelter clustered in a loose, wary bloom. The deli cashier waved at Eliza from the second row, flanked by 2 cooks in aprons. The stagehand at the door wore the look of a man who'd bet on a horse and decided to love the race regardless. Rafi set the bench. Eliza stepped out in the smoke-colored dress. No jewelry, hair pinned in a way that looked like she hadn't tried and had. The room lowered its voice. She sang for like a secret given to the right friend. She sang Bach like a set of stairs that you climb and find yourself somewhere softer. For the lullaby, she thought of her father and of nights in the shelter when she'd been the person who needed the song. She watched Carla wipe at her eyes and then pretend she hadn't. She watched the donor's posture relax. She saw Sophie breathing with her. Then Avenue Maria. She spoke, which she rarely did from a stage. I was told once, she said, that I should never sing to prove a point, only to tell the truth. I'm not here to prove that street vendors belong in concert halls or that miracles happen in aisles. I'm here to say thank you to a song that found me when I didn't know what to ask for. She nodded to Rafi. He placed the first notes in the room like a dish on a table. Eliza didn't gild it. She let it be as simple as it is when sung in kitchens and churches in the collapsed middle of an afternoon. The hall stripped itself of polish for the length of the phrase. The rain outside accompanied with a small hiss. When she reached the end, she didn't float the note. She let it sit. She let it be ordinary and therefore holy. Silence. Then applause that cracked a little at the edges because people were clapping for things they couldn't name. She scanned the shelter cluster. Carla nodded, once like okay then. The deli cashier inhaled like a man who'd been underwater and found he could breathe. Anya ushered everyone to a side room where sandwiches and coffee had appeared as if conjured by faith and logistics. No orchestra today, she announced cheerfully to the shelter group. But the clarinetist made egg salad. While people ate, an older man with a beard neatly trimmed into dignity approached Eliza with the careful step of someone who had learned to announce himself. Name's Walter, he said. I used to sing in a baritone quartet, back when dinosaurs walked the earth and I could read a train schedule without squinting. He chuckled. It's a good thing, the breath. It's yours when you've got nothing else. It is, Eliza said, and felt that truth lodged deeper than most truths are allowed to. By late afternoon, the rain had gone. The city steamed lightly, like a plate cooling. Jonathan found Eliza in the wings, staring at the empty hall with the look of a person who has broken into a museum at night and wants to touch the paintings. He folded himself onto the step beside her, sighing like a man who had earned it. For once, he didn't have a list. We did a decent thing today, he said, as if confessing a weakness. We did, she agreed, and we will probably be punished for it by the gods of efficiency. He snorted. They sat in companionable quiet for a minute. Then he said, there's a thing I haven't told you because I didn't want to put weight in your pockets when you were learning to run again. She waited. I wrote Untitled City after I walked my wife home from chemo every Tuesday for a year, he said, voices flat and careful as a road. We watched New York be a place where people asked us to hurry while we were trying to learn how to be slow. We watched it not be kind. Not because anyone hated us, but because the city is an organism and sometimes it can't make room. He rubbed a thumb along the edge of the stair. She died in October. I finished the piece in December. I wanted the soprano to sound like the street does when you finally forgive it for not moving out of your way. Eliza didn't speak. She put her hand on the stair next to his, so that if he moved his hand, he would feel that there was ground and someone on it. I say this now, he continued, because what you did Friday was not about my genius or your luck. It was about a room learning to be kind for 7 minutes. You did that. I can't program that. I can't budget it. I can only recognize it and get out of its way. She nodded and found herself crying again, silently, in the suddenly enormous quiet of a hall without people. Thank you for telling me, she said. I won't put it in a headline. I know, he said. That's why you get to know. Near the stage door, a debate had broken out among the brass about whether egg salad could be improved with paprika. Anya solved it by sneezing dramatically and declaring all paprika communism. The world seemed to right itself on the axis of small stupidities that make it bearable. That night, Eliza walked home the long way again and ducked into the park where the guitar man sometimes sat. He was there, or a cousin of him was, a woman with a ukulele and a dog that had opinions. Eliza listened. The woman sang something country and beautiful, the dog sighed. When the song ended, the woman looked up. You're the girl, she said, not like a headline, like a recognition. The one from a fancy place. I'm the girl from this place too, Eliza said. Do you know the chorus, To Wayfaring Stranger? They sang it together. Two voices, unamplified, made for each other by the accident of evening. No applause, just the dog wagging once like he was paying them. On Friday, an email landed in Eliza's inbox with a subject line that made her heart skip. Carnegie Hall, inquiry. She opened it with the kind of cautious reverence you use for doors in old houses. A series on new voices. An invitation to audition. A paragraph that managed to flatter without lying. She sent it to Jonathan with the words, help me think. He wrote back, we think after Sunday. Today we sing. Sunday brought the final performance of Untitled City for this run. The house was full in a way that felt less like a trend and more like a habit. People had told people. A young couple in jeans. An older woman in enormous earrings. A guy with paint on his hands. The cashier again. Carla and two other women from the shelter, dressed in exactly what they wanted to wear. Sophie in the back row, face a lighthouse. Dr. Ruiz in the mezzanine, hands folded carefully like he was keeping joy from spilling. Eliza sang the city the way it had started to sound in her bones. Less like a challenge, more like a home that tolerates and loves you, often in the same hour. She missed one note by a hair's width and didn't let shame write a novel about it. She found a new color in a middle vowel and wanted to keep it in a jar for later. She looked at Anya on the breath she had promised to look for if she forgot she had lungs and saw the violinist breathing for her anyway, just in case. The standing ovation this time felt like neighbors waving from stoops. Familiar, affectionate, only slightly theatrical. She loved it. Backstage, Mara hugged her very briefly, like an eclipse. Now, the coach said, we build the rest of your voice, so this doesn't become the only room you can live in. Teach me, Eliza said, and meant it in the oldest way a student can mean it. Near the loading dock, a journalist Eliza had come to tolerate, and sometimes asked for one last quote. What does this week mean? She asked. In real terms? It means I have a key card to a practice room, and a reason to use it, Eliza said. It means I owe sandwiches to a lot of people. She grinned. It means I get to learn how to do this when no one is watching. And what about the story? The journalist pressed. The story is a beginning, Eliza said, surprising herself with how little she owed it. Not a definition. When the building finally exhaled her into the evening, Eliza didn't turn left or right. She stood there, a person on a sidewalk in a city that would forget her in a week or remember her forever or something between. She thought of her father's hand on her shoulder and Jonathan's on the stair and Mara's thermos and Anya's sarcasm and Sophie's fierce, ridiculous kindness. She thought of Carla's question about sandwiches. She lifted her phone and texted Jonathan, Mara, Anya, Rafi, Dr. Ruiz, Sophie, the deli cashier, whose number she'd bullied from the receipt, and Lila. Free concert in the park next month? Lunchtime. Half the orchestra if we can bribe them. Bring your own chair. No tickets. Just breath. We'll call it City Unplugged. Jonathan replied first. Only if we can terrify the city with kindness. Mara. Only if no one whispers. Anya. Only if I can play barefoot and threaten the trombones with egg salad. Rafi. Only if there's a piano. I don't care where we steal it from. Dr. Ruiz. Only if the fourth years serve water. Sophie. Only if I can sing harmony on one thing and then heckle you affectionately. Lila. Only if you promise to eat a sandwich first. Eliza laughed, alone, and felt not alone. The night pressed its cool hand to her forehead. The city hummed. She sang one line under her breath, not to prove a point, but to tell the truth. The voice you carry is the home you keep building, even when you think you've lost the address. And when a passerby turned and smiled and didn't say anything at all, she smiled back. Not the smile of a miracle, not the smile of a myth. Just the smile of a woman who had work in the morning and a room to sing it in. The park smelled of thawing soil and roasted chestnuts, the kind vendors sold from battered carts that left the air sweet and smoky. April had softened New York's edges, and Eliza's impromptu idea, City Unplugged, had somehow solidified into a real thing. There was no marble, no velvet, no chandelier this time. Just folding chairs scattered on damp grass, borrowed risers, a piano that had been wheeled out of a church basement and tuned under protest, and a crowd that didn't seem to care about imperfections. Some had come because of the newspaper story, some because of a flyer taped to a lamppost, some because they happened to be walking their dogs and decided music was as good as any excuse to pause. Eliza stood at the front, her hair pulled back in a way that felt freer than polished, a light jacket against the chill. She wore no gown, no borrowed, smoke-colored miracle of a dress. Just herself in jeans and boots, a microphone balanced on a stand that hummed with occasional static. Behind her, half the orchestra had indeed shown up, bribed by Anya with promises of sandwiches and the thrill of doing something mildly rebellious. Mara sat cross-legged on a picnic blanket near the front, thermos in hand, her sharp eyes softened by the sun. Jonathan leaned against a tree at the edge of the crowd, a figure at once separate and central, watching as though the music were a fragile experiment that might break if he blinked too hard. "Thank you," Eliza said, her voice carrying across the park with the microphone's uneven help. "We call this city Unplugged because New York is never unplugged, and neither are we. This is for anyone who's ever thought music belonged only in places with tickets and chandeliers. Today, it belongs to whoever can hear it." Applause rose, ragged but warm. She felt it like a hand on her back. They began, a Bach chorale, simple enough that even the children could hum along. Then something playful, Anya's violin tearing through a folk melody, the winds laughing with her. Eliza followed with a lullaby she had learned from her father's mother, a tune so old it barely had words, her voice weaving it into the air like smoke that didn't want to disappear. The crowd thickened as the music spilled outward. Joggers slowed. Bikers stopped. Strangers leaned against trees. At one point, the deli cashier set down a tray of sandwiches and grinned when Carla from the shelter grabbed two. And then Eliza sang the line that had found her in the Hale Theater aisle, Ave Maria. This time she wasn't interrupted by laughter, wasn't forced by lights to stand straighter than she felt. She sang it for the park, for the city, for her father, for the people who had followed her here because they believed, or wanted to believe, that music was a common language, not a gated one. The note rose, held, floated. A pigeon startled from the tree above, wings catching the sunlight, as if even birds had been waiting for a cue. The crowd applauded, not thunderously, but sincerely. And Eliza, standing there with jeans frayed at the cuffs and a microphone that squeaked when she shifted, felt something she hadn't in weeks. Peace. But peace in New York is brief. By Monday, photos of the park concert had circulated online. Headlines range from opera star brings music to the people to street vendor turned soprano goes folk. Some loved it. Others sneered. A critic wrote that her voice was undeniably powerful but lacked polish, as though sincerity could excuse a lack of refinement. Another claimed she was the perfect Cinderella for an audience too desperate for stories to notice when the glass slipper didn't fit. Eliza tried to ignore it. She told herself the music mattered more than the noise. But at 3 a.m, when the shelter's cubicle walls were thin and someone was crying in their sleep, the words found her. Lack polish. Cinderella. Not enough. The next day's rehearsal at the Conservatory felt heavier for it. Dr. Ruiz had arranged for her to use a practice room during off hours, and standing inside it again was like stepping into an old photograph. The piano keys were chipped in the same places. The walls still smelled faintly of varnish and ambition. She sang scales, then lines from Untitled City, then phrases of Ave Maria. The sound bounced back at her, rawer than she remembered. Every wobble magnified. Every tight note a reminder of the critic's voice. You're listening with their ears, Mara said when she stopped by unannounced, thermos in hand. Don't. They said I wasn't polished, Eliza admitted, hating herself for the confession. Good, Mara said flatly. Polish is for furniture. Music needs grain. Splinters. Places where the hand remembers it touched something alive. But what if they're right? Then they'll keep writing while you keep singing, Mara said, sitting on the piano bench as though it were a throne. And when you've sung long enough, they'll run out of adjectives. Critics are sprinters. Musicians are marathoners. Eliza breathed. It wasn't relief exactly, but it was something solid enough to stand on. The following week, Jonathan called her into his office. His desk was cluttered with sheet music, coffee cups, and a stack of letters unopened. He looked tired in a way that was bone deep, but his eyes sharpened when he saw her. Carnegie Hall wants you, he said without preamble. Eliza blinked. What? An audition. Their new Voices series. He slid the email across the desk. You could say no. You could say yes. Either way, it's noise. What matters is whether you want to do the work it asks of you. Her throat tightened. Carnegie Hall had been a dream she'd whispered to herself as a student, half in fear, half in hope. The thought of standing there now, without years of conservatory grooming, without the safety net of slow progress, it was exhilarating and terrifying. Do you think I'm ready? She asked. Jonathan leaned back, steepling his fingers. You're not. No one ever is. But readiness is a fiction. What you are is willing. That's enough. She left his office with the email printed in her bag, her pulse a drumline in her ears. Word spread quickly. Sophie called her that night. Carnegie, Sophie said, her voice half envy, half admiration. That's huge. I'm scared, Eliza admitted. Good. If you weren't, I'd slap you, Sophie said. Then, softer, don't let them turn you into a brand, Eliza. You're a musician, not a headline. Her father's voice echoed in her head. Don't let them silence you. Sophie's voice layered over it. Don't let them define you. Between the two, Eliza found a path. The weeks blurred into rehearsals, interviews, and small performances. Church basements, community centers, a gala where she felt like a stranger among diamonds. Each room carried different weight, different expectations, but all of them wanted something from her. Sometimes applause, sometimes authenticity, sometimes proof that she deserved to stand where she stood. One night, after a particularly grueling donor dinner where she'd been paraded like an exhibit, Eliza escaped to the park. She found a saxophonist again, the one whose blues had once pulled her hum from hiding. He was playing under the lamplight, notes curling into the night like smoke. "Mind if I join?" she asked. He shrugged, grinning. "Only if you don't outshine me." She sang with him. No microphones, no critics, no chandeliers. Just voice and horn and the occasional bark of dog. Passers-by stopped, smiled, dropped coins they didn't need to, and moved on. When the last note faded, the saxophonist leaned against the bench. "You sound like someone who forgot where she came from and then remembered in the middle of a song," he said. "Maybe I did," Eliza said. "Good," he replied. "That's the only way it matters." Carnegie loomed closer. The night before the audition, Eliza lay awake, staring at the ceiling of the small apartment Jonathan had arranged for her near the theater. Her basket was long gone, but sometimes she still felt its phantom weight against her arm. She whispered into the dark, not a prayer exactly, but a promise. "I will sing," she said, "not to prove, not to survive, to tell the truth." Morning came in a color the city rarely remembered, soft as unbleached linen, a pale wash that didn't insist on anything. From her small borrowed apartment near the Hale, Eliza watched it climb the brick across the alley and felt something inside her unclench by degrees. Today was the Carnegie audition. It would not be a premiere with an orchestra and thunder. It would be a piano, a jury, a few chairs scraping, a throat that had learned how to be brave and might forget. It would be work, the kind that respects and dismantles you at the same time. She boiled water, poured it over the tea Mara had labeled voice, not nerves, and stood with the mug cupped in both hands. The apartment was barely furnished. A narrow bed, a chair, a second-hand table where her score lay open to a page marked with more pencil than paper. In the corner, a thrift store coat rack held the smoke-colored dress in a garment bag, and, next to it, the jeans and jacket she'd worn for City, unplugged. Her life had become a closet with two doors, chandelier and sky. She tried both on, depending on the room. The phone buzzed. "Aunt Lila, you're already enough. The audition is just the room figuring it out. Anya, if anyone in a suit glares, imagine they're my C string. We know how to tune them. Mara, characteristically late and practical. Eat egg. Steam face. Don't read. Don't prove. Breathe the long way down. Sophie, stand center. On the air. If your top note wobbles, smile like you meant it to and make the wobble the point. Jonathan, bring yourself. Let them meet the person the music brought to rehearsal." She ate the egg. She steamed. She did not read. She didn't rehearse calamity. She wrapped a scarf around her throat and stepped into a day whose sidewalk seemed to say, with each slate square, here, and here, and here. Carnegie's backstage smelled less of dust than myth, like thousands of coats being shrugged off and put on again, like a century of nerves. The audition was in a small recital hall, intimate enough to hear the seams in a person. A woman behind a folding table took Eliza's name and number with polite efficiency and a kindness that had learned not to be demonstrative. "You'll be fourth," she said. "Warm up rooms down the hall. We're running on time." Fourth. She had always hated the limbo of middle. Not first enough to set the bar. Not last enough to leave a shadow. But she was not 19 anymore. She would not ask the hallway to name her. She would ask the room. Rafi had agreed to accompany. He appeared with his tie tucked into his shirt like a superstition and his smile tucked into his eyes. "No heroics," he said softly, stacking his scores. "Just truth." She warmed up in a room that had the acoustics of a cereal box. Hums, lip trills, vowels rounded and released. Her breath found its long, even path. The memory of the critics lacked polish, tried to creep under the door and failed. She remembered Mara's voice, grain, not gloss, and smiled. Grain was what Maid would catch light. Through the thin wall, a tenor strained a high note that sounded like a ladder missing two rungs. Someone else practiced a run so fast it lost its point. Eliza closed her eyes and sang one line under her breath. Not from Untitled City and not Ave Maria, but the lullaby she'd given to the park. The room couldn't store the history of a melody, but her body could. She let it. When a volunteer cracked the door and called her name, she felt calm enough to be surprised by it. The hallway was quiet. The piano on the stage gleamed without arrogance. 3 people sat at a table with pens, water bottles, and the particular alertness of people trained to pretend they're not deciding your life. One of them, a woman with a cap of gray hair and a mouth that looked like it smiled on holidays, nodded. Ms. Maren? Welcome. Start when ready. She stood center. She owned the air because Sophie had texted it into her bones. She signaled to Rafi. They began with 4, not to charm, but to show the room that Legato could gather a day's weather and lay it on shelf without spilling. The middle line, the one that asked for a breath you didn't realize you owed, came and went without drama. Rafi breathed with her. Somewhere near the back, a chair shifted because a person had remembered their body. She felt the gentle click of that recognition like a gear catching. Then Bach, the aria that folded patience in a hope and tied it with a bow even skeptics had to admire. She made the first ornament a thought, not a trick. On the second, she let a smile loosen the corners. The woman with the holiday smile set down her pen. Good, Eliza thought without triumph. We're in a room together now. Last, the vocalized from Untitled City. She had asked Jonathan if she should bring his work into this room. He had shrugged without false modesty. Bring what makes you honest, he'd said. She'd written the vowels on the first page anyway, as if the muscle of language needed to see itself to do its job. The first phrase rose like a familiar street. The bridge, the narrow one where fear liked to set up a toll booth, came and did not demand currency. The top note turned its little knife, and she pressed her fingertip to the blade, felt its edge, and did not bleed. She didn't aim for the shimmer she had found on the best days. She aimed for the line, not to break. That was hard enough. The last breath was there when she asked it to come. Silence. Not the careless kind. The kind that steps close to see if your pupils dilate. The woman with gray hair said, "Thank you," and meant it. The man next to her asked, "Could we hear the second section again, from letter B?" Rafi placed his hands like a surgeon who believed the body would cooperate. They did it again, and this time Eliza let herself risk a small tenderness in the middle vowel that she discovered on Sunday. The room caught it and held it, as if someone had cupped wind. "Thank you," the gray-haired woman said once more. She didn't smile. Eliza understood. An audition is a room preventing itself from being carried away. She bowed her thanks to the room anyway, and to Rafi, and left. In the hallway, she exhaled laughter she hadn't known she'd been holding. Rafi bumped her shoulder with his. "Good," he said. "True. No heroics. No polish," she said. "Grain," he agreed, pleased. Outside, spring asserted itself. The city had put on that thin, reckless jacket it wore for 2 weeks every April, and then forgot somewhere on a bar stool until October. Eliza walked without checking her phone. She could not make the room decide. She could only leave the door unlatched for whatever would walk through. Back at the Hale, the rehearsal room felt like a ship she could sail without thinking. The orchestra had a different piece in front of them. Someone else's city, someone else's storm, but the room lifted its head when she stepped in as if to say, "We know your feet." Anya waved her bow like a flag. Mara lifted the thermos. Jonathan glanced up and performed the smallest of nods. A welcome reserved for the people he trusted not to waste the room. "How did it go?" he asked at break, not leaning on her answer. "I didn't try to be a miracle," she said. "I was a musician." "Then you gave them something to take home," he said. Miracles evaporate. By late afternoon, the email arrived. The subject line contained the word congratulations and the sober admonition that this was an invitation to the series, not a coronation. A date 2 months off. A stipend. 3 rehearsals. Repertoire to be approved. Bring a pianist or use theirs. We look forward to hearing you again. She texted the screenshot to the small constellation of people who had lodged themselves around her life like streetlights. Replies came back like thrown hats. Aunt Lila used 6 exclamation points and an emoji that looked like a party wearing a hat. Anya sent 10 violin emojis and 1 egg. Mara sent a period, which, coming from Mara, meant acknowledged, we double your breath work starting Monday. Sophie sent a string of capital letters without vowels. YRRNCRD. Jonathan sent, good. Now we prepare like boars, so the night can be interesting. She didn't celebrate yet. She walked to the deli, where the cashier pointed a finger at her like a cowboy and poured coffee without asking. Carla from the shelter sat at a corner table with a stack of job applications and a face that had decided to mean business. Eliza slid in across from her. You going to Carnegie? Carla asked, as if she were asking whether Eliza were going across town. I am, Eliza said. You coming? If there's sandwiches, Carla said. There will always be sandwiches, Eliza promised, and meant it as an oath about more than food. The next weeks were a blueprint of dull brilliance. Morning warm-ups that looked like nothing felt like everything. Long tones. The miniature carpentry of vowels. The discipline of stopping when stopping prevented breaking. Mara added exercises with names that sounded like patience disguised as torture. Siren walks, wall breaths, candle trills. We will make your lungs so boring they become reliable, she said cheerfully. Reliability is what lets you risk generosity. Repertoire decisions felt like choosing which rooms of herself to show. They settled on a program that made a map for her to greet the room. A set of American art songs that tasted of river and brick. A new work by a young composer who kept bees on a queen's rooftop and wrote lines that swarmed and settled. One aria, not to genuflect to tradition, but to shake its hand. And a quiet, stripped Ave Maria at the end, not as a trick, but as a circle closing. The article accusing her of being a plant mutated into think pieces about authenticity and class. She read none of them. Once, in a moment of weakness, she Googled her own name and found a photo of herself at 19, eyes starlit and ignorant, posted under a headline that made her flinch. The girl who left. She closed the browser and went for a walk. Outside, a child dragged a stick along a fence and made a song of it. The city had critiques of its own and ignored them with grace. A week before Carnegie, Dr. Ruiz invited her to speak to a fourth-year seminar. She stood in front of the room where she had once stood with smaller shoes and bigger arrogance, and told the truth with just enough polish to keep the sharp edges from slicing her classmates. No one owes you a stage, she said. Not even if you're good. Especially not if you're good. The stage owes the audience a room where truth is possible. Sometimes you're the person who makes that possible. Sometimes you're the person in the 5th row learning how to be brave because someone else is doing the work. Both count. And if you have to sell roses to stay in the city where your voice makes sense, sell roses. Don't sell your voice. A hand went up. Anxious, smart. What about luck? A student asked, careful not to look as if he believed in it. I was lucky, she said. But luck is only a key. It doesn't know what room it opens. You still have to walk in and say something worth hearing. Afterward, in the hallway, a girl with a flute case and a defensive shrug thanked her and said, my mom keeps asking when I'll get a real job. Learn one thing about tax law, Eliza said deadpan. Then you can say you have benefits. The girl laughed and laughed, relief leaking out like light. The day came. A soft rain took the dust out of the air. Carnegie's small hall was a bowl of wood and light that made sound behave. Backstage, the quiet had the respect of a library that only loaned out miracles to cardholders who returned them on time. Rafi stood at the piano, rolling his wrists like a conjurer. Anya had bullied her way into a seat in the 3rd row and wore the expression of a godmother who had smuggled fireworks into church. Mara leaned in the doorway and held up 2 fingers in a V. Not victory, Eliza thought, but vowels. Jonathan did not make speeches. He looked at Eliza's face long enough to recognize it, and then looked away, granting her the dignity of not being dragged ashore. Remember, he said, as if this were the first day of kindergarten, Reality is the warm-up. The music is the work. The story is what strangers do with their spare time. She stepped into the light. Applause, polite and curious. She bowed to the room the way she had learned to bow to work without apology. Rafi sat. They began. Ford greeted the room with good bread and butter. The first American song tasted like a stoop in August. The second like a train at midnight passing a field you'd forgotten was there. The set of new music hummed and darted and finally landed, the way bees do when they remember they belong to a shape. The aria demanded she shake the hand of tradition firmly enough to see if tradition would squeeze back too hard. It didn't. It nodded once and let her go. Before the last piece, she stepped forward. She had planned to say nothing, but the room asked for a word, and she had learned not to ignore a room that asked politely. I used to hum this in places where I wasn't supposed to, she said. A chuckle, a theater aisle, a stairwell. It made trouble. It also made a door. I like to sing it here as a thank you for both. She sang Ave Maria. No ornament. No shimmer for shimmer's sake. Just a grain of wood, the line like a road you walk because it leads you home. The hall did what good halls do. It listened back. On the last note, she didn't float the question mark. She placed the period, gentle, certain, silence. The kind that feels like someone has put a hand on your back and said, stay here a second longer than is comfortable. It will be worth it. Then applause that built without frenzy, shoulder to shoulder with joy, and people stood. Not everyone. Enough. Anya hooped and was shushed and didn't care. Mara's eyes did the private eclipse again. Jonathan closed his eyes for half a breath and reopened them, as if checking whether the room he was in matched the one he had hoped for. Afterward, in the small crush of bodies that makes even sacred spaces smell faintly of deodorant and nerves, a woman in her 70s took Eliza's hand with a grip that erased the difference in their ages. My husband died in that seat, she said, pointing with her chin. Not today, she added wry. 10 years ago. He loved 4. I heard him in your vowels. Thank you. A teenager with purple hair and a program covered in doodles hovered. My mom made me come, she announced. I told her I hate classical music. I still do, but I like to be one. It made my stomach feel weird. Is that normal? Absolutely, Eliza said. The bees nest near the stomach. Outside, the rain had paused to listen. The street made its faithful noises. The deli cashier had closed early and stood on the sidewalk as if he had simply teleported. Sandwiches tomorrow, he called. On me. Carla texted a photo of her first paycheck from a diner with the caption, benefits maybe eventually. Aunt Lila sent a video of a porch swing moving in an Ohio afternoon. No faces, just the sound of weather. Dr. Ruiz emailed a single sentence. You made the room kinder. Sophie sent a selfie from a crosswalk, scarf up to her nose, eyes bright like someone who had let herself be proud without a price. Back at the Hale, the green room felt like a room at the end of a pilgrimage, used, forgiven, grateful. Anya sprawled on the couch like a teenager whose basketball team had just won. You didn't wobble on the top, she said, indignant, like a friend denied the opportunity to be ferociously supportive. I had a whole face prepared. It wobbled in rehearsal this morning, Eliza said. I smiled until it was embarrassed and left. Mara set down the thermos and, in a move that shocked the orbit of at least 3 satellites, hugged Eliza for a full breath. Remember this feeling, she said into her ear, the words so soft they were almost unsaid. It's not the applause. It's the room admitting it listened. Jonathan waited, not above the party and not quite in it. When their eyes met, he inclined his head like a man acknowledging weather. It rained. You did not drown. Now it gets dull, he said with delight. Lessons. Practice. Boring, glorious maintenance. We will get so good at maintenance that your generosity on stage can be reckless and cost you nothing permanent. I'm ready to be dull, she said, and realized she meant it. The next days slipped their hands into Ordinary's gloves. She taught a Saturday class at the shelter, breath and sound, no singing if you didn't want, humming if you did, laughter encouraged by accident. Walter, the baritone who read train schedules without squinting, demonstrated posture with such dignity that Mara would have approved. The ukulele woman from the park came and led a chorus on a song so simple it made the room learn to be complicated again on its own later. Eliza walked past the spot where she had once dropped her basket on the floor of a theater and stepped into a fate. The basket was gone, of course. The echo wasn't. She could still hear the squeal of a microphone, the sudden hush, the joke that died and became an apology without words. She let herself stand there a full minute and then walked on, because the city appreciates a person who knows when to move. An email from the Conservatory arrived. No alumni office this time. Dr. Ruiz again, with a proper invitation, a visiting artist residency for a week next spring. Teach, sing, talk about the economics of art to the students who would someday be asked to sing to a room that had paid for the privilege. She said yes with the caveat that there would be no glamour in the syllabus. He replied with a smiley face typed out of punctuation like a dad, and she laughed until she missed a step on the curb. When the first real paycheck arrived with her name on it, and a number that represented more than survival, she went to the florist and bought roses. Not to sell, to give. She brought them to the shelter, the deli, the practice room door at the conservatory, the stage door guard who had first called her Ms. Maren and then agreed to call her Eliza, to Carla at the diner, to the saxophonist in the park. For your case, she told him, dropping two in like an echo. He shook his head, grinning, and gave one to his wife who had come by to pretend she wasn't checking whether his reed needed replacing. On a mild Sunday that pretended to be the start of summer, she walked to the small bridge in the park and found the spot where the leaves applause without wind. She didn't sing. She sat. She let the city be loud around her and found the frequency under it, the one that only attention can hear. It sounded like breath. It sounded like the room listening back. It sounded like a father saying, "You belong here," not as a command or a prophecy, but as a description of the present tense. Her phone buzzed. She glanced. A message from a number with a country code she didn't recognize. "We are organizing a tour of community halls across the Midwest. Churches, school gyms, union centers. Bring your program. Bring your story. Bring your insistence that music belongs to whoever can hear it." She smiled. "Yes," she typed, then added, "only if we can feed people afterward." "We thought you'd say that," came the answer. She sent a group text. "Road trip. Sandwiches. Songs. Don't bring your delicate shoes." Replies cascaded. Anya claimed the passenger seat and the playlist. Mara refused to step into any vehicle without veto power over the air conditioning. Rafi asked if there would be outlets for dying pianos in desperate need of tuning. Eliza promised extension cords and patience. Jonathan wrote, "Write me postcards from rooms that learn to be kind. I will hang them in the rehearsal hall like weather reports." She stood, stretched, and started home by a path she didn't know she knew. On a corner, a girl with a basket stood uncertainly, her eyes flicking between people like she was afraid of being seen and of not being seen in equal measure. Eliza paused. The girl's roses were fresh. Her gum was cheap. Her voice, when she offered them, was soft and apologetic the way apology becomes a habit. Eliza bought a rose and a pack of gum, and before she could change her mind, said, "You have a beautiful speaking voice." The girl blinked. "I do. You do," Eliza said. "If you ever want a place to stand and be heard, we're singing in the park next month. No one gets a laugh. It's a rule." The girl looked at the rose like it might teach her something. "Maybe," she said shyly, "if I'm not working." "Bring the basket," Eliza said. "We'll need gum." She walked away without waiting for gratitude, because gratitude is often a heavier basket than gum. Half a block later, she heard a hum. A small, unplanned sound. She didn't turn. You don't startle birds. That night, as dusk feathered the tenement bricks and a square of sky called itself a roof, Eliza opened the window and let the city in. She set the rose in a jar. She turned off the phone. She sang one line, then two, then let silence take a verse as if it were a soloist who had earned it. The silence held up its end of the duet. Somewhere across town, a room filled with strangers would decide whether to stand up after a piece ended. Somewhere else, a woman would decide whether to go to a job interview or stay under the blanket. Somewhere a student would choose between practicing and sleep. Somewhere a composer would place notes in an order that dared a person to be braver than they had planned. The city did not need Eliza to supervise any of this. The city had learned to be itself long before she learned to hum in aisles. But there are days when a life asks to be believed. She believed hers, not because of chandeliers or standing ovations or emails with subject lines that contained congratulations. She believed it because her voice belonged to her again, and she had chosen, again and again, when given the chance, not to let the world silence it. She closed the window. She brewed tea. She folded her program notes for the Midwest tour into a rectangle that would fit in her pocket. She placed a pen above it because rooms like to be written about more than they like to be photographed. She stood in the quiet and said, to no one and to everyone, I am not my last note. Then she amended it, smiling. I am not only my last note. In the morning, she would rehearse. In a month, she would ride a bus where the air smelled like teenage basketball teams and hay. In a year, she might stand in another hall and teach someone with purple hair how to make their stomach feel weird on purpose. In 10 years, she would buy coffee for a girl who was both her rival and her reflection and tell her where to stand so her breath could reach the back row without begging. For now, Eliza lay down. She slept. The city, mostly merciful, kept watch. And somewhere, a leaf applauded without needing wind.